All right. So, Professor and Dr. William Moore, Director of American New England Studies Program at Boston University. Thank you so much for joining us on Scoring Compass podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you. I'm always happy to talk about my work.
So, speaking of your work, I came across your name through, I can't even recall, to be honest. It was a Google search about Masonic architecture, I believe, and your name came up, as did your book, and we'll throw a copy of the cover, Masonic Temples, Freemasonry, Ritual Architecture, and Masculine Archetypes. And the title alone to any Mason is going to be of interest, so I was able to do a bit more research. I really, really enjoyed what I was able to review of the work for a lot of different reasons. First, on a personal note, you review what you describe as the golden age of Masonic temple building, which was 1870 to about 1930. And that is, the Windsor Masonic Temple, my home Masonic Temple, which is a beautiful location, was built in 1921. Detroit, right across the river from Windsor, that Masonic Temple was built in the same period. And I have heard the 1920s themselves described as the golden age of Freemasonry. So before we go on any further, to talk more about your work, in your work, what was it about that time period in specific that you were interested in? Why did you focus on that particular time period?
Well, my book is about reading architecture as historical evidence, and specifically trying to understand what Masonic temples tell us both about Freemasonry, but also about American and Canadian society at that time. And as we mentioned, or as you mentioned earlier, it focuses on New York State because even that, I was talking about thousands of buildings. So to do a bigger study, I never would have finished. I never would have completed it. So I needed a discrete data set, as my people that work with computers and digital are always saying, data sets. So my data set was the Masonic temples in New York State. But from that, we can make more larger generalizations about Masonic temples in North America. And so 1870 to 1930, that's the period in which the most Masonic temples were built, and certainly the grandest Masonic temples. And I think it's fair to say, you mentioned the Detroit Masonic Temple, the largest and fanciest ever built. There's never been a period since then when Masonic architecture has met the standard that was set in that time period. So I think there's a couple of things about that time period, 1870 to 1930, that can help us have perspective. But then I'll also get to answering your question about why the 1920s is such a blossoming, such a fertile period. So I want to start by thinking about the economic changes that are taking place in North America in this 1870 to 1920 period, or 1930 period. And there's two big transformations, and they're both related to industrialization and corporatization. So the first one is simply what economists have called the great deflation, right? That in this time period, through industrialization, through mass production, the economy expanded rapidly and created greater income for a vast array of North Americans. So North Americans between 1870 and 1930 simply had a higher standard of living, simply had more money, simply had more material goods. So what was possible for Masonic organizations during this period expanded rapidly because there were more people that had more money, that had more discretionary income that they could put into buying all the things that were required for fraternalism, whether it's Knights Templar uniforms, or whether it's all of the scenic backdrops and the props that were required for putting on the Scottish Rite rituals theatrically, even down to the fact that that men could afford to have fancy embroidered Masonic aprons, right? All of that became possible because there was so much more money around and because manufacturing became so much less expensive, right? So that's one simple reason, is that the Great Deflation made it possible to own more things. But then the other piece, the kind of the cultural piece rather than the economic piece, is that during this Great Deflation, during this big transformation in the economy, as well as having more goods and more economics, there was also a transition in the mode of economic production. So all across North America, in a large case, we went from being an agricultural society to being an industrial society, and from being largely a rural society to being a society that had at least 50% of its population living in cities, right? So all of this meant that people found themselves unsure about what their life was going to be like. You know, instead of being your own boss and having to work in the fields and seeing what you could produce, you were suddenly invested in an industrial economy that you didn't have control over, and which you didn't have control over your wages, you didn't have control over the economic swings that were going on, booms and busts and so forth. So with all of this, people became very unsure about how society should be structured and what their role was in society. So fraternal organizations more broadly, and Freemasonry in particular, because it presented itself as an ethical society that had its roots in biblical history, it gave people, in this midst of massive social and economic change, it gave men the idea that there was a single identity of masculinity that could give them hope and could give them stability throughout this socioeconomic change. So that, you know, the biblical values that the craft degrees gave of loyalty and of hard work, what Marianne Clausen has called the artisanal values of the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry, could ground men and could give them kind of psychological support as the entire world changed around them. So that's kind of the bigger picture, right? And during this period, because Freemasonry gave people this role and this position in society, membership grew. And because they had more money, they could build stable and single-use Masonic temples. So in the pre-Civil War period, in the antebellum period in the United States, most Masonic lodges, when they met, either met in a tavern or they met in a temporarily rented room, right, where they would use tracing boards to present the ritual. But after the Civil War, in the 1870s, they started to be able to have dedicated rooms with furniture that was specially bought for the ritual. And then as the membership grew, they kept building bigger and bigger temples, and they kept outgrowing those temples. So there were some communities in New York State in this 1870 to 1930 period where they would build 3 or 4 temples, and each time they would outgrow. They would not build big enough, and they would outgrow it. So by the 1920s, Masonic organizations all across North America were were hedging their bets by building buildings that were significantly larger than they actually needed, because they didn't want to be outgrown again. So this is why you get these fantastic structures like the Detroit Masonic Temple, which, as you know, was actually never completed because the Great Depression struck and they weren't able to live up to the expectations that they had set for themselves. But all across the country in the 1920s, all across North America in the 1920s, there were all these spectacular Masonic buildings, and in that I include Shriners Mosques, that were built that were bigger than they actually needed. And when the Depression hit, they had leveraged themselves, and many of them were lost to bankruptcy almost immediately, like Mecca Temple in Manhattan in New York City, or the Shriners Mosque in Richmond, Virginia, which was lost to bankruptcy almost immediately when the Depression hit. So it's partly because the membership had been growing so quickly, but it's also because they expected that the membership would continue to grow, and they built larger than they actually needed, and that's what they and they get caught by that. But that's why the 1920s has such spectacular structures, is because it's the culmination of a 50-year period of growth, which then is brought to an abrupt end with the onset of the Great Depression.
I definitely want to discuss more about the book we're discussing, your work, Masonic Temples. But one thing I've always been very fascinated about is I have a hard time, myself personally, kind of separating, kind of trying to imagine looking at Masonry from the outside in, because I was born into it. My dad and my grandparents, my grandfathers, and great grandfathers, to our knowledge, anyways, were all Masons, and then I've been a fairly active Mason for the past 13 years. But I'm always interested in individuals such as yourself. You're not a Mason. I know in your acknowledgments to your work, you are thankful to New York Masons for all their assistance. But I guess as somebody from the outside of the craft, what is it that inspired you to do this research? When you were going into the research, did you have any expectations? Did anything surprise you throughout your research about Freemasonry? And even has the book was published 2006. Have you continued to research aspects of Freemasonry, and has anything else surprised you since?
Yeah, well, my great-grandfather was a 50-year Mason in the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts as well. So certainly Masonry in that time period was pervasive, and many people find, even when they don't recognize it, that they've got Freemasons in their background and in their history. I came into it, as I say, from an American studies academic background, and again, I already mentioned that it was about thinking about architecture as historical evidence and trying to read buildings as text. And in really a class project that I was doing as a graduate student, I became interested I was then thinking about furniture, and I found that there was a furniture company in Massachusetts, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that specialized in producing fraternal furniture. And I found a catalog from the 1870s that had images of this fantastic ceremonial furniture that the A.B. and E.L. Shaw Company was producing. And in many ways, this furniture was interchangeable with church furniture, except instead of having crosses on it, it had squares and compasses on it. And I realized, having found this document, that I really did not know anything about fraternal furniture, and why was there such a market for fraternal furniture that a company could specialize in it. And it also had an engraving of an extraordinarily fancy chair that they called the Haverhill Masonic chair. And Haverhill is a town. It's an old mill town in northern Massachusetts near the New Hampshire border. So I was going to school in Boston at that point, and Haverhill wasn't that far away. So I called up the Haverhill Masons and said, I'm interested in your furniture. And they didn't know what to make of me, you know. But I guess at that point they thought that it was good to have, you know, a young man, and I was young at that point, come be interested in the fraternity. So they welcomed me up to come and look at the Haverhill Masonic Lodge Room. And the Haverhill Masonic Lodge Room was in the top floor of a commercial building, a 3-story brick commercial building, and it hadn't been changed significantly since the 1870s when they built that building. And, you know, it was like a time capsule. I felt like I was Indiana Jones with the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, that here I was in this ritual space with this spectacular furniture, with murals on the walls, you know, and I now can tell you what the murals were. You know, they were faith, hope, and charity. But at that point, you know, the top of my head blew off, and I thought, what is this place? You know, I've never seen anything quite like this. I knew that there was a fraternity called the Masons, but I didn't know anything about what they did or what their rituals were. And suddenly here I was in this, at that point, more than 100-year-old ritual space, and I needed to figure out what it was all about. So that's where that was the beginning of this journey, was going to the Haverhill Masonic Temple and trying to figure out what this ritual space was. And then as I worked on it, as I went from one temple to another, I found that each of them had a ritual space like this, and that there was a specific ceremonial usage of it, and that the space was used to teach certain values and lessons, and that the space was inherent in the way that the fraternity taught those ethics and morals. So that was the roots of the book. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. Going back to the book, one thing I really liked, and I underlined it because it's something I kind of try to think in the same way. You talk about the Masonic temples, or particularly the lodge room within a temple, as kind of being a space that exists kind of, it's not meant to be tied down to a particular time or particular place. It's meant to represent something larger. I know when I, for example, go into a Masonic lodge room, whether it be for a meeting or a practice, I always try to think of it as, you know, I'm not just stepping into a lodge room of, you know, June 1st, whatever year. I'm stepping into a room that, you know, existed 100 years ago, will exist 100 years from now. It's a place that's meant to be outside of the particular day and time you're in there. And outside of a particular place, it's, you know, I go to the lodge room in Windsor, but it's representative of lodge rooms throughout the world. So can you just talk about that idea about kind of Masonic lodge rooms meant to exist kind of outside of particular dates and times, but meant to be an all-encompassing space?
Right. And it's what you might call a mythic space, right? That time melds into itself. So it doesn't matter if you're in 2020, or whether you're in 1942, or whether you're in the American colonial period, or really the way it's set up is that you're supposed to be feeling as though you're one with and in harmony with the biblical builders of Solomon's temple, right? When Solomon supposedly, when God reached down and had Hiram Abiff set up the fraternal brotherhood, you know, or had Solomon set up the fraternal brotherhood to commemorate the martyrhood of Hiram Abiff, right? So it's supposed to bring you into communal contact with every brother, the ones that are there with you in the room, but also the ones that have been witnessing the transformation of men into Masons, going back into the mists of eternity. You know, and there's a great Masonic poem from from just around the 1920s. I don't remember the exact date. Entitled "Last Night I Knelt Where Hiram Knelt," right, where the the initiate, the man that's coming into Freemasonry, is playing the role that every initiate has played going back into the mists of eternity. And similarly, the master of the lodge, playing the role of King Solomon, becomes King Solomon and inhabits the wisdom of King Solomon. So that, and again, this is what I was talking about, that why was this so appealing to men in this period of great industrial change, was that as everything around them transformed, they could continue to inhabit these masculine archetypes of being King Solomon, of being the journeyman or the entered apprentice. That masculine idea didn't change as everything else changed. And when I was working on this back in the 1980s and 90s, the Masonic membership numbers were kind of dropping. But I've been interested to see that Masonic membership numbers more recently, there are more young men joining. And I think that's at least partly because of the economic uncertainty of the current time. That, I know men who are computer programmers who don't know what company they're going to be working for 6 months from now. They know that they will continue to be doing coding. They know that they will continue to have some place in the high-tech world. But in the middle of the 20th century, people frequently worked for the same company for 50 years, and they found their stability in their employment, right? And so Masonic membership could kind of drop off because people identified themselves as being working for IBM or working for GE or something like that. Now, when you never know who you're going to be working from 6 months ago or 6 months in the future, I think that there's more men who are now once again finding stability in the fraternity, so that no matter who they're going to be working for 6 months from now, they know which lodge they'll still be a member of and who their brothers will be 6 months from now.
That's an interesting, that's definitely something worth considering. I can speak from my experience, which is, we are, the issue, at least in my opinion, from my district and just Masonry, from what I've seen, is not so much a membership. I think membership is a bit of a red herring right now for Masonry. There's an emphasis on increasing membership, but we have definitely, I found, stabled off in terms of actual membership, in terms of getting people to join. The challenge seems to be attendance, and actually translating membership into attendance.
Participation, right.
Yeah, and that may have something to do with what you were discussing with how things have changed. So work hours are so much more unstable. Jobs can change so quickly. Even community connections with all the instability in employment seems to be affecting our ability to have, I remember growing up, my dad was a Mason, my mom was involved in the ladies auxiliary, things like that. I regularly had babysitters. My dad at a lodge meeting, so they would just go to the neighbors who had, high school aged kids and whomever. When I was master, I've been master 3 times now. Constantly getting phone calls from guys saying, I can't make it to lodge. My wife has to work and I have to watch the kids. And then, if I bring up babysitters or stuff, they don't know their neighbors very well, or it just seems like the challenge for Masonry in a modern sense is more translating any membership gains into actual participation gains or actual involvement, because it can be incredibly demoralizing for a lodge to initiate somebody and then they never show up again.
Right.
I guess it seems like, though, in the golden age of Freemasonry, that wasn't as much of an issue. It seems like membership increases also translated into participation increases. Do you think that had to do with because of the way society was set up, more community involvement, more single income households, things of that nature?
Yeah, I've got a few different thoughts about that. The first is, as you go back and read the records and read the Masonic periodicals and read what Masons were writing about Freemasonry, what you find that throughout history, people are making the same complaint that you make, which is that people come in, they become members, they pay their dues, but they're not really attending as much as the people who are the leaders want them to. So I think that issue of participation is, or minority participation, meaning that the minority of people who are members are participating. I think that's a through thread in Masonic history, right? And what you find is that that the same people who are active in the Blue Lodge are the ones who then go on to become active in the other appendant bodies, right? And then those people are also active, so you've got a minority, and then those people continue to be active. And the best predictor of whether they're going to go from the chapter to the commandery is, membership in other appendant bodies. So you've always got this big number of people that hold membership cards, but who aren't coming to lodge and aren't going through the chairs. That doesn't seem to change over time. What does change over time, I think, is what you were talking about also with changes in other social structures, right? And how changes in larger society impact the fraternity. So one of the places where this happens is in the 1920s, where in the before the 1920s, the fraternal organizations are all meeting in the evenings. And whether you are a bank president or whether you're a clerk or whether you are a farmer, when the sun goes down, you have free time and you can go to a lodge meeting. But then in the 1920s, with transformations in the economy, suddenly you had a managerial middle class who had the freedom to take long lunch hours. And you suddenly had other fraternal organizations that sprung up, most notably Rotary, that was having their meetings in the lunch hour. And that kind of made a class stratification in fraternal organizations, because, if you were working in a factory and punching the clock and you had 1 hour for lunch, you didn't have time to go off and do your fraternal stuff in the middle of the day. And then the people that were doing that, the people that were getting their fraternal needs met in these business fraternities that met in the middle of the day, they ended up kind of dropping out of the Odd Fellows and the Knights of Pythias and the Freemasons, who continued to have their meetings in the evening. So there was a kind of socioeconomic transformation in the fraternities that happened then in the 1920s because of that. And then the other one that you mentioned is how late era capitalism, starting in the 1970s, required two-family households, two-family income households. And before this, with what historians talk about as the separate spheres, that there were distinct gender roles in marriages. With the separate spheres, the idea of childcare wasn't part of men's responsibility. So they'd come home, they'd have dinner, and then they'd go back out to the fraternity, and there was no question that they were going to have childcare provided by their wives, right? That was kind of, a lot of, in the last 6 months, we've ended up talking about structural racism, right? Well, this is an example of structural sexism, right? That the fact that men had the freedom to go off and belong to all these different fraternal organizations in the evenings was dependent upon the fact that they had free childcare labor from their wives, right? And that changed in the 1970s with the transition in the economy, so that middle-class families could not support themselves with only one income. And once you had women coming home tired from work as well, that created this problem that you're talking about of men can't participate in the fraternalism because they have to figure out what they're going to do about childcare.
And in the 1970s also, because I've been researching some of these things, you also saw, I think it was called the Great Decoupling. It was when you saw median incomes level off, but GDP continued to go up, and that just reflects the need for two-income households, which is you see this GDP increasing, which is an indication that the economy is going well, but individuals can no longer afford to support themselves on one income because the median income isn't raising, which I think is an interesting thing.
Which is leading us to the high levels of income inequality that we see currently.
I'm kind of a dummy. I'm not that smart, but so I wanted you to talk about this a bit more because I really loved the phrase that you used in your book. You talked about architecture as providing a cognitive framework for Masons in particular, but also just for people. And you know, I'm smart enough to kind of know what those words mean, but I'm not that smart. It just sounds right to me. This idea of architecture is something that, you know, when you're in a building, the architecture will help provide a framework for which you can think and consider things. But can you go into that a bit more detail, both from a Masonic perspective and Masonic Lodge perspective, but also just in our day-to-day lives, how the architecture around us affects our cognition and the frameworks that we use to navigate?
Sure. There's a couple of ways that I think that Masonic temples create a cognitive framework.
Actually, before we go further, could you define cognitive framework and how you're using that here?
Okay. So what I'm thinking here is that you know, we think certain ways, right? And the way we think is structured by the rules that we have in our head. So again, and here I'm gonna fall guilty of the American exceptionalism, right? To think about people in the United States as slightly different from other people, right? So, and again, I have spent my career writing about the United States, so that's where I feel most comfortable. But I also have lots of Canadian relatives. My wife was born in Montreal, so I'm also a little bit aware of the differences between American culture and Canadian culture, kind of writ large, which you can stop me short if you think I'm wrong about these things. But so the cognitive framework, right? Americans, for example, believe you know, overarchingly, we believe in democracy, right? So when we set up to have an organization, you know, our default position is to elect a president, right? And to have elections to try to choose who the president is. And that's different from the way society was structured in Europe before the Enlightenment, right? Before the Enlightenment, before America, when you had an organization, the default was that the aristocrat got to run things, right? And the aristocrat, the nobleman, the earl, got the deference, and everybody else just basically did what they gave them the respect that was due their position, right? So there's two different kind of cognitive frameworks. One is we respect aristocracy, and the other is we believe in democracy and everybody is basically equal. So that's one way I'm thinking about cognitive frameworks, you know. And it was really interesting to me, again, as an American, I went to a Masonic, World Masonic History Conference that was held in Scotland. And and in the middle of this conference, it was an academic conference, but a Masonic conference at the same time. In the middle of it, a lord came in, a British lord. And I was, as an American, I was absolutely shocked by the deference that that was given to this aristocrat who, his identity and the reason he was given the deference was because the family he was born into and the estate that he was associated with, right? It wasn't because he was the Grand Master of Scotland. It wasn't because he was a recognized academic scholar. It wasn't at all based upon the position that he had earned or the position that he'd been voted into. It was simply the deference was based upon who he was born to be, right? Which again, as an American, with all my biases, I was amazed to see this, in a fraternity, which everything that I've read is about how the fraternity believes that that we all meet on the level, right? But here in this international Masonic conference, we weren't meeting on the level. This guy was obviously higher up, So again, that's what I'm talking about with cognitive framework, right? So, so how do we get those ideas, and how are ideas like that communicated to us, right? And so one way in which I talk about Masonic architectural cognitive framework being given is this idea that we've already talked about, that the Masonic lodge room is outside of time, right? And that it's a myth, it exists in a mythic time frame rather than in a chronological time frame. And one way that happens is partly the fact that there are no windows in the lodge room, right? That lodge rooms are separated from outside reality, specifically by architecture, but then also by the fact that lodge rooms are frequently decorated in specific historical motifs. So if, for example, if you go to the Grand Lodge of New York on 23rd Street in Manhattan, you go in there, there's one room that's the Egyptian room, right? Where the lodge room is decorated as though it's from ancient Egypt. And then there's another room that you go into that's the Gothic room, as though it's out of medieval Europe. And it's got Gothic arches, and it's got trefoils and all sorts of medieval imagery. Then there's another room that you go into that they call the colonial room, that's decorated with Windsor chairs, and it looks like you're in George Washington's living room from colonial Virginia, right? And each of these lodge rooms, when you go into them and you perform the same ritual, it's, if on Monday night you're in Egypt and on Wednesday night you're in ancient France or in medieval France, and then on Friday night you're in colonial Virginia, that even if you're not reading the magazine, even if you're not keeping up with the written record in Freemasonry, that tells you as a participant, oh yeah, this fraternity has existed unchanging for millennium, going back through ancient history, right? So there's that's kind of the symbolic imagery on the walls of the buildings. But then also there is literally the floor plan of the Masonic lodge room, right? Which is benches or seats or settees surrounding in a rectangle around the altar in the center. And certainly some of the seats are emphasized. So the master's seat is emphasized, and the junior warden seat is emphasized, and the senior warden seat is emphasized, right? So that you can see that that there are people that are the officers. But the important thing is that as people are performing the ritual in the center, doing the floor work around the altar, the brethren are all looking at each other and seeing each other, right? And that that floor plan of the seating cements the mystic ties of brotherhood and makes the brotherhood a physical living thing rather than just a philosophic or abstract concept, right? And I want you to compare that to a standard Protestant church meeting space where everybody is sitting largely in rows looking at the preacher at the front of the room, and there's an altar at the front of the room, right? And there, rather than emphasizing the relationship between the people in the pews with each other, that floor plan is emphasizing the relationship between the individual believer and the minister, and then God as the cross above the altar, or at the altar, or at the communion table, right? So there you've got a one-to-one relationship between the believer and the larger religious world, as opposed to in the Masonic lodge room with the benches around the outside. Nobody is ever having only a one-to-one relationship with the everlasting, with the celestial lodge above. Everybody is having a group communal understanding of what the world is like, and that the group is important to that. Does that make sense? Do you understand where I'm coming from?
It
so
does.
That's what I'm thinking about cognitive framework, right? So that the cognitive framework of the lodge emphasizes the group as being important, as opposed to, in evangelical religion, it's the individual sinner that's important, and their relationship with God, not their relationship with the congregation. That's the primary one.
I like that a lot. I like also was near the start of your answer, but I like that phrase. A lodge room exists in mythical time as opposed to chronological time, which I plan to steal that and use it a few times myself. But you got the credit for it. It's on the podcast. But I like that.
In the book. It's in the book.
Well, there you go. So I'll make sure to cite you every time. But I think it's a great way to put it. And I absolutely understand. Yeah, a Masonic lodge room, by its floor plan, whether it's Windsor or New York, it does emphasize kind of a group relationship as opposed to a church, or even like a theater where somebody's giving a talk. Everybody's they're not facing each other, they're facing towards whoever is providing the talk or giving the lecture or the sermon, or whatever it is.
Right. And that's one of the big transitions in Masonic architecture is as the Scottish Rite rituals become more and more theatrical at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and as they start to integrate more and more theatrical technology, including lighting and including backdrops and so forth, the Scottish Rite spaces go from being lodge rooms to being theaters, and it's a gradual transformation where originally the Scottish Rite ritual spaces were just oversized lodge rooms, where by the time they're building the Detroit Masonic Temple, the Scottish Rite Theater is literally a theater. And instead of, and you now have one person that's a stand-in that's going through the ritual, but most of the people who are having the degrees conferred upon them are sitting in the seats and going through the ritual by proxy, by watching the theatrical presentation, right? And so, what this does for the Scottish Rite is it allows them to initiate hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals at a time, which means that they can, it's a mass production of fraternal membership, which allows the Scottish Rite to have their coffers expand exponentially, right? Because instead of having to go through 3 rituals, one at a time for each individual, you can do all 32 degrees over a weekend and have 600 guys go through it at the same time, and they all pay you your initiation fee, they all pay you membership dues, and that again puts money into the pockets of the organization which allows them to build the spectacular Scottish Rite cathedrals that they built at the beginning of the 20th century.
So you mentioned the Scottish Rite, and we've discussed a lot about Craft Lodge or Blue Lodge. And in your book, you talk about masculine archetypes, and you mentioned 4 in particular that relate to kind of the 4 most well-known Masonic orders: Blue Lodge or the Craft Lodge, York Rite, Scottish Rite, and the Shrine. Could you talk a bit about those? You know, what are those archetypes, and how do they associate with the Masonic orders?
Right. So the other piece of this, of course, is that many people in the present kind of think of the structure of Freemasonry, these different orders that you're talking about, as they don't think of them historically and as having been evolved historically. But there actually is kind of a historic time period, a historic frame for when these organizations reach their culmination, right? So the first one is the Blue Lodge, right, which is of course the oldest, and most of Masonic history literature is about when exactly did the Blue Lodge, as we understand it, come to exist, right? And people have answers all the way from 1590 or 1340 all the way up to 1713, right? And that doesn't, for our purposes, that doesn't matter. By 1860, the Blue Lodge was pretty solidified, right? But then the Knights Templar really takes its modern form in North America after the Civil War, right? And that is linked to men wanting to perform military drilling and to do synchronized marching and to have a kind of masculine military identity, which I think is in many ways is tied to the American Civil War. And I think it could also be a reason why I don't think that the Knights Templar were ever as popular in Canada as they were in the United States. And so again, in this period after the Civil War, suddenly there is a demand for militaristic masculine performance. And the Knights Templar fill that in, and suddenly everybody's wearing uniforms that are the same. They're marching with swords that they never think that they're actually ever going to use to kill anybody, but it, and again, because the Knights Templar have this idea of that they are successors to the medieval Knights Templar, just like the Blue Lodge is the successor to the biblical builders of Solomon's Temple, the Knights Templar are a religious group, right? So that they are a masculine representation of what Christianity should be like, right? And that expands, and suddenly the Masonic temples that are being built need to have facilities that fit this new order that is fulfilling a masculine desire in North American society at that time. So you start to get buildings that have what they call armories, which are places for men to store their uniforms and to store their swords, and in some ways become locker rooms before the YMCA has really defined what a locker room should look like. They are literally locker rooms, places to hold your equipment. And then they also start to have banquet halls that the Knights Templar can use as drilling spaces. So frequently when you see a Masonic temple with an extraordinarily large banquet hall, it's not just because they wanted to sit down and break bread together. It's that space actually also served as a kind of gymnasium where they could practice their martial drilling. So then we've already slightly talked about the Scottish Rite, which expands really starting in the 1890s and going up to the 1930s as they start to use theatrical technology to perform their degrees. And and the Scottish Rite is able to tap into the Western esoteric tradition to be teaching people hidden knowledge, whether it's Rosicrucianism or whether it's numerology, or there's all sorts of different esoteric traditions that are fed into the Scottish Rite through kind of the French esoteric revival of the 19th century. And so suddenly men are able to tap into being wise men or magi's or religious leaders through the Scottish Rite, through knowing this system of occult knowledge, or having keys to the system of occult knowledge that the Scottish Rite is supposedly teaching. And it's interesting that this is going on at the same time that in North America, Protestantism is becoming more and more feminized, and the authority figures in the Protestant churches in North America tend to kind of have a more feminine identity through the gender divisions. So with the Scottish Rite taking off when it does, there's lots of different pieces that come together. There's this, again, esoteric occult revival that's going on in Europe at the time, as well as new theatrical technology, as well as reacting to transformations in American religious identity, right? And then the fourth one is the shrine, right? And the shrine, the ancient Arabic order of the nobles of the mystic shrine, is the last of these to develop. Its earliest roots are in New York City right after the Civil War, but it doesn't really take off until 1900. And I think my argument is that the shrine is the final step of Freemasonry adapting itself to 20th century capitalism, where it's kind of like the famous Dale Carnegie book that's about how to win friends and influence people, and which puts an emphasis on personality and being a good fellow and fitting into society and having a sense of humor and being able to get along, as opposed to the earlier fraternal organizations that are all about righteousness and character and uprightness, right? Where the Freemasonry makes a big deal out of the plumb bob and the square, right, which are teaching, rectitude and right living. You don't have the equivalent in the shrine. The shrine is about being a good fellow and crossing having a good humor about crossing the burning sands and allowing people to poke fun at you and to live in a fantasy world. The shrine is about a fantasy world of the Middle East that's outside of capitalism, where you don't have to go to work every day, where you can pretend to live in a harem with dancing girls, and again, it's a very 19th century ethnocentric vision of Islam, right? That Islam does not belong to the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? And of course, the most damning piece of it, the piece that shows that the people that were founding the shrine didn't really understand Islam at all, is what a prominent place drinking has in the shrine, when in Islam people are not supposed to be drinking. So that fourth identity I end up calling the jester or the fool, right? And then in the 1960s, when it becomes kind of offensive to people to continue to pretend to be Arabs, right? As we get a larger Arab population in North America, and it becomes more and more difficult to pretend to be Arabs as Shriners. That's why the shrine then moves over to frequently having clowns, right? Because clowns are, a cultural figure that again exists outside of capitalism, exists outside of the workaday world, but is not ethnically offensive to other people, right? So the shrine still has people driving around in small clown cars and pretending to be clowns, because it serves the same function without having the ethnic slur involved in it that they had at the end of the 19th century.
I like that word you used in your answer, specifically with the shrine, but I think it's a good kind of jumping off point. The idea of the shrine being something that existed particularly to adapt to kind of adapt to the changing capitalism culture of the start of the 1900s. You know, we, as somebody on the outside of Freemasonry who's done a lot of research looking in, how do you see Freemasonry adapting moving forward? We talked about some of the unique challenges that, I mean, it's not just Freemasonry that's facing it. Freemasonry churches, the great book, you know, Bowling Alone, talked about a lot of this stuff. Whether it's, you know, the great decoupling of the 70s and that suddenly the requirement for two-income households, or kind of just people putting more of a spotlight on all sorts of historical inequalities that we're still feeling the effects of today. Certainly right now we're dealing with a pandemic, and there's a lot more questioning even about things like the role of democracy, economics, how all these things affect. It seems like there's a lot of change happening, and there's a lot of societal, or if not change, then at least a lot of people questioning a lot of things that were taken for granted for a long time. How do you see Masonry adapting to this moving forward, or do you think it can, or it has to? Or I guess, somebody on the outside, what are your views about Masonry moving forward?
Well, as someone that somewhat identifies as a historian, I always have to take this stance that what I'm about is explaining the past, and you're always asking me to move into a difficult situation where you're asking me to predict what's going to happen in the future based upon what's going on in the past. But one of the things that I think sometimes gets lost in Freemasonry is that because there's this strong mythic identity, right, and people always refer to the ancient landmarks, right, and so much of Freemasonry is about precedent, and that things are unchanging. That's the idea, is that things are unchanging. But when you actually look at Masonic history, you find that it is constantly changing, right? That there are certain things that don't change in Freemasonry. One of them being this idea of the individual within the group, right? And that the perfect ashlar is required to build the temple, right? So that you have to be able to think rationally and control your emotions to be able to work as part of a group, right? So that emphasis on the individual within a group is one of the things in Freemasonry that never changes. But outside of that, everything changes. Whether it is, we've talked about meeting in taverns versus meeting in spectacular Masonic temples. Whether it is doing rituals, that are mostly mouth to ear, or whether it is conferring degrees using theatrical backdrops, right? So what I would say is that my prediction is that the fraternity will continue to evolve, and that it's a strong enough identity that people will always want, that there will be people who will always want to be Freemasons. And, there are changes, right? So one of the big changes over the last, going back to the 70s, is the breakdown of the distinction between Prince Hall Freemasonry and straight mainline Anglo-American Masonry, right? And you very rarely continue to hear people talking about Prince Hall lodges as being irregular, right? In the 19th century, racism was always hidden under the cover of regularity, that white Masons would excuse their racism by saying that the Black Lodges were irregular, which if they actually went and did the research, they would find that there was a set of regularity for these Black Lodges if they wanted them. And that, as I say, you very rarely hear white Masons continue to talk about Prince Hall Lodges as being irregular, right? That has fallen by the wayside. Similarly, just from what I've been seeing through the pandemic, I get the impression that that Masons are becoming more and more comfortable with electronic meetings, right? That that as the internet took off, there was all sorts of questions about, you know, how can Freemasonry exist in cyberspace? And there have always been people, I think Dr. Gary Dreyfus, is that his Dreyfus at MIT has been one of the people that's kind of been pushing, you know, Freemasonry into the electronic world for the last 30 years. But I think it's this pandemic that has really started to, I see that there are electronic Masonic meetings taking place because Masons don't want to give up meeting, even when they realize that sitting in a lodge room could mean the death of almost everybody in the lodge, right? So that, I think, is a transformation that we're going to see in the future. And then the one that I don't really know, I can't predict what's going to happen, is the issue of women in Freemasonry in the United States. You know, in other parts of the world, women in Freemasonry is not controversial. In France, in particular, there are lodges that have women in them. And up until this point, Masonry in North America, you know, and there are exceptions. There are lodges that are chartered by the French Lodge, the French Grand Lodge that lets women in. But they're few and far between. The vast majority of North American lodges are masculine only. And I don't know if that's sustainable as American society or as North American society changes. You know, and again, that's part of this issue of two-family households, you know, and the change in marriage conditions. You know, is it useful to make men choose between going to lodge and having their wives with them, right? If you look at the American Boy Scouts, they've made the decision that it doesn't make sense to not allow daughters to attend Boy Scout events, right? Because again, they had the same issue as if the father goes off to a Boy Scout event with the son and the mother's at work, who's going to take care of the daughter? And why shouldn't the daughter be taking advantage of the character lessons that are being taught in Boy Scouts, right? And again, if you think in some ways Boy Scouts, you know, through Lord Baden-Powell can be seen as a kind of British Empire offshoot of Freemasonry, right? So if the Boy Scouts are recognizing that girls need the same kind of character education that boys do, why shouldn't Freemasonry recognize that women need the same kind of character education that men do, right? So that's the one that I don't know what's going to happen. You know, what is Freemasonry going to break down the walls and let women be full members rather than pushing them off into women's affiliates like the Order of the Eastern Star?
Do you think that, yeah, going back to the Eastern Star, you know, do you think maybe one of the possible solutions could be, you know, a stronger Eastern Star, perhaps not having the requirements? Because right now, to be a member of the Eastern Star, you need to be related to a Mason. I mean, so if you're already pulling from a pool of X percentage points to get your Masons, then naturally to go that next step, there's going to be, you know, economies of scale, it's going to go down. And then as your Masonic membership declines, especially, you know, you saw those massive drop-offs in the 70s, 80s, 90s, then it's natural. I mean, you're going to see it's going to hit the next level hard. It's going to hit. So, I mean, I've always thought one potential idea would be to just remove that requirement from the Isshin Star and create, make it its own, I guess, sorority equal to Freemasonry, in that any woman of mature age, 21 years old, or in the States, or 19 Ontario, can join. Seems like one good option to me. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting possibilities moving forward. One thing, I don't know what you would think about this. This has been my belief for a while, and everybody thinks I'm crazy, so fair warning. In your research, did you come across, I'm guessing you would have, because it's such a ubiquitous phrase, you'll often hear Masons tell younger or new entered apprentices, new guys joining, your priorities should be family, work, and then Masonry. So I think that maybe is recognizing the changing roles of society, and that men are required to spend more time working and more time with their families. But the idea of, with one of the benefits of the internet, of things, is the ability to professionalize almost anything. You can monetize a podcast, you can monetize, if you love The Walking Dead, you can do a podcast about The Walking Dead and sell t-shirts and make X amount. Everybody always says Masonry can't be a professional organization at all, and no one can pursue it in a professional manner. But to me, things like Patreon and things, it provides opportunities for individuals, if they're interested, to pursue what was always meant as a hobby in a professional manner. And then you remove some of those conflicts. You don't have to choose between going to work and going to lodge, because going to lodge is part of your income, because you need to attend lodge to create your next podcast, to promote Masonic information. So the idea of trying to take advantage of some of these things, be it Patreon, podcasting, selling things on the internet, to professionalize the craft and create a level of professional Masons. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, being from the outside looking in.
I'd say that it's again one of these things where the stated beliefs of the organization are in conflict with the reality of the history of the organization. So that throughout the 19th century, there were people who were making a living from Freemasonry. The best example of this is a guy who was the SGIG, the Sovereign Grand Inspector General of the Scottish Rite for Kansas, whose name was Bester Gaston Brown. And Bester Gaston Brown also was a salesman for one of the big fraternal regalia companies. And he also was a salesman for the Scottish Rite theatrical backdrops that I've talked about a couple of times. So he was, as the SGIG, he was responsible for chartering Scottish Rite valleys all over the great American Northwest, up into South Dakota, into Wyoming. And he was spreading Freemasonry as the SGIG. And then at the same time, he would go and visit these fledgling organizations to help them to grow. And in doing that, he would then sell them regalia and theatrical props and scenic backdrops so that they could put on the rituals better, so they could grow better. And at the same time, of course, he was earning a commission on everything that he sold to them. And as these organizations grew, and as they needed bigger spaces, he would buy back the scenery that he'd sold them 5 years earlier and then sell it to another fledgling valley, and get commission both on buying it back from the valley and on selling it to the new valley, right? So that's a guy who was helping the fraternity at the same time that he was helping himself and being a salesman and a manufacturer's representative. And another example is in New York City, one of the great sources that I used for writing my book was the weekly newspaper that was called, the Masonic Standard. And the Masonic Standard came out every week, and it was published out of editorial offices in New York City's Masonic Temple, right? They paid rent to the fraternity. They had their editorial offices there. They had reporters that went to the Masonic meetings and the Masonic beefsteak dinners. They went to the testimonials that were happening. Freemasonry was big enough at that point that there was interesting stuff going on in New York City, all throughout the state, up into Buffalo, up into Rochester, and he was providing a service to the fraternity by creating this newspaper, but he was also selling advertising in the newspaper. And and the owner of the Masonic Standard was making a living by being a Freemason and providing a service to the fraternity. So once you start looking back into it, you find that throughout the history of the fraternity, there have been people who have had economic interests for being in the fraternity, and also having had economic interest to seeing the fraternity prosper. Even going all the way back to the tavern keepers, right? The tavern keepers that would give over the use of their space to the lodge, and lo and behold, after the lodge was over, people would hang around and have a few beers, right? And it made sense to allow the lodge to meet in the tavern because they knew that twice a month they would have steady customers.
It makes sense to me that, if maybe this is the more conservative side of me coming out, if you want to encourage growth in anything, tying it to an economic interest can only be helpful, because how much harder are you going to work to promote something if your economic interests are somehow tied up in it, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean, I think sometimes people have this idea that tying financial interests with something, somehow sullies it, but I've never understood that argument. I mean, no one, to use MMA as an example, mixed martial arts, no one would argue that the UFC fighters don't love their sport. It's just that they're at a level where, in order to pursue it at that top level, they can't do that and also work 40 hours a week at Walmart. They need to be able to dedicate themselves fully to it, and do that, they need to be able to earn a professional income from it. But that's always been something, I think, maybe an adaptation that, I guess it's a readaptation. It's looking back to, the Masonic Standard and tavern owners, people of the past, and reconsidering this idea of separating any type of financial or economic interest from the craft. Like and I think the tavern is a great example of it, as is the Masonic Standard, as is Bird and Gusta Brown. Their work ultimately assisted the craft to grow, like you described, as well as themselves. And then the more they grow, the more the craft grows. It just cycles through. So I was lucky enough to, as I said, be able to find your book, Masonic Temples, Freemasonry, Ritual Architecture, and Masculine Archetypes. It was on Amazon, it was on Google Books, but is there anywhere else people can order it from if they're interested in it?
Well, the most direct place to order it is from the University of Tennessee Press website, which, they're the ones that published it, the University of Tennessee Press, so they'll sell it to you. But you can also get it through interlibrary loan. So it's in libraries really around the world. I was very pleased to see that there's actually a library in New South Wales that owns a copy of it. So it's in libraries around the world, and if you just talk to your local librarian, you can get them to get it for you through interlibrary loan. But then then you have to return it. Probably the better thing is just to buy a copy to give to your own local lodge library, and then they'll have it for other brothers to have as well. I've also told people that I think it's a relatively good book that represents Freemasonry in a respectful manner. And there's so many anti-Masonic books out there that end up in public libraries, that one way that you can make sure that the public has a respectful book about Masonic history is if you give your local public library a copy of this book.
I agree completely. Everything I read, I really enjoyed it. So many things, help me reevaluate not only Freemasonry.
Okay, you're unmuted. I missed that last part.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll try one more time. This part I might edit. Who knows? Before we finish, I sent you some pictures of the Windsor Masonic Temple, the beautiful Windsor Masonic Temple, and my lodge room in particular. Just as we finish off, based on your research and your work and your position within the art and architectural department, what type of thoughts did you have about the Windsor Masonic Temple and the lodge rooms?
Well, it is a classic example of a 1920s Masonic temple. It is exactly what I'm talking about in the book with the lodge room. It's got two different lodge rooms, right? But both of them, even though they're different sizes, they still manifest that same floor plan, right? And then the neoclassical outside of it, which exerts solidity, right? And the classical columns on the outside of it make it look as though it's timeless and that it should be there forever. Looks like it stretches back into antiquity, but also because it's a timeless architecture, it never goes out of date, so that it looks as though it's kind of a solid institutional identity, and that people will want to be a member of the fraternity because that they have that identity of solidity in the building. Yeah, so the unfortunate thing is that buildings like that all across North America are being lost as the fraternity decides that they can't afford to maintain them anymore. And the problem is that it's, there's so much wealth and so much value that's inherent in that building that once a fraternity, an organization moves out of their building, they no longer have the capability of recreating it, right? So once the building gets lost, kind of the corporate identity of the fraternity is lost also. And there's just not the same draw to going to a meeting that's being held in a church basement or in a rented function room in a hotel out on the strip. It's just not the same as meeting in a purpose-built spectacular building like that. So I consistently urge fraternal organizations to do everything they possibly can to maintain and keep their building. It seems like you're doing a good job of that you have other tenants coming in and using the building. Yeah, and that's the first step, certainly.
Temple Board is certainly working hard to do all they can to save it. It's such an important part of not just Windsor, not just Masonic history, but the region's history. It's hosted so many weddings and dances, and then people, even if they're not Masons, have memories of the Masonic Temple in Windsor.
Right. Right. And when the buildings were built, frequently they had civic ideas in mind, right? That they were building the building not just for Masonic uses, but also for community uses. And somehow that idea of the Masonic Temple as a public space, as much as it is a private space, that was lost somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. Again, I think partly because the fraternity was so successful and they had so much going on in the buildings that was purely Masonic that the public uses kind of got forced out of it. And then as the fraternity downsized, nobody made the effort to go out and welcome the public back in again.
Well, we're working on that. That's one of the things Current Council is working on. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me all the way down from Boston. I very much appreciate it. And okay. Yeah, I'll throw the picture of the book up again. It's definitely worth getting in the library for both Masonic libraries and municipal libraries, and it's definitely worth owning a copy because it's been a terrific read, and it's helped me. From what I've read so far, I'm starting to get my copy. From what I've read so far, though, it's a terrific it provides a lot of valuable insight into the role that architecture plays in our craft. So it's very much appreciated. And to
Thank
everybody
you
else,
so much for having me, Cameron. I really appreciate it.
thank you so much. And everybody watching this, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, check out Patreon, all that good stuff. And thank you so much.